Top U.S. officials, including the defense secretary, have said that sending U.S. troops to Iran could not be ruled out. But given public opinion in the United States, such a move would come with political consequences for Donald Trump and the Republicans, especially with midterm elections approaching in November of this year. However, there are reports that the White House is looking to enlist and even arm separatist groups in the region to accomplish having boots on the ground. Monty Francis has the details.
Airstrikes alone rarely topple a regime. If that is indeed the goal of this joint U.S.-Israeli campaign, missiles may not be enough. In a recent interview with the New York Post, Donald Trump said he would send in U.S. troops if necessary. But with polls showing just 12% of the American public in favor of such a move, it would come with a deep political cost. On Wednesday, the nation's top general tried to distance the military from the political fray.
Well, I'm not going to comment on U.S. boots on the ground. I think that's a question for policymakers, and I don't make policy, I execute policy.
If not U.S. troops on the ground, there are reports that Donald Trump has called leaders of Iranian Kurdish factions in northern Iraq to see if they are willing to take up arms against the regime. Under such a scenario, Washington could provide air support if the Iraqi Kurds cross the border and provide intelligence support to Kurdish groups inside Iran. But experts say it's far from a sure bet, given that the Kurds have a long memory of American betrayal.
In 50 years, the U.S. has used the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, on multiple occasions. And when they no longer need them, they've betrayed them. And I know the Iraqi Kurdish leaders are very much aware of this, and it's something the Iranian Kurds might want to consider.
In addition, experts say the Iranian Kurds don't have the same military resources or training as the Iraqi Kurds. Another group posing a potential threat to the regime are the Baloch militant groups, some of whom have reportedly crossed into Iran from Pakistan. But experts have warned that backing such armed groups could open up a hornet's nest and increase the chances of a messy civil war if the regime collapses.
Monty Francis with that roundup. Let's bring in Daniel Schneiderman, Director of Global Policy Programs at Penn Washington at the University of Pennsylvania. Daniel, thank you very much for being with us. Boots on the ground is what we were discussing. The question, I suppose, is whose boots and who pays?
Yeah, look, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your viewers. I am a deep skeptic that U.S. boots on the ground would achieve the objectives that the administration has set out, which, by the way, are changing every other day. I'm also a deep skeptic that the political cost would be something that this administration wants to overcome and take on. And I think, look, there is a challenge here in that the president set the precedent that this operation was about regime change from the very beginning. And so now you have seen how they have tried to walk that back over time. I actually think it's much more possible that the administration is looking to empower other forces to do the kind of groundwork that would be required.
Those forces, Kurds notably, the Baloch group we were talking about as well. Is there a danger that in bringing together disparate groups for one particular aim at one particular moment is kind of like opening a Pandora's box situation in an already very volatile region?
I think that's the perfect way to describe it. And frankly, the United States has had real challenges, even with groups that are much more ideologically aligned, like the opposition groups that tried to coordinate in Syria. And that was a deeply challenging and difficult process for the United States to try to execute, even under more ideal circumstances where they're operating across the border from Turkey, which is much more permissive than any kind of access they'll have inside of Iran. So leave the operational part of it aside. There is a whole legacy around empowering Kurdish separatist forces, which is very meaningful. And it is entirely possible that Kurdish groups in Turkey and Iraq and in Syria will read the U.S. empowering Iranian Kurds as another opportunity to seek either greater independence or some form of federalism or other independence otherwise. And that has the possibility of kicking off conflict in other places around the region and further destabilizing things, as you rightly identified at the top of the program.
I just had a very cynical thought as you were explaining this to me, Daniel. Is there some way that transactionally Donald Trump sees a way of benefiting here? Clearly there is oil at stake in various places. Could that be somewhere in his thinking?
Look, I think it's entirely possible. I think that Iran, as a specter and exporter of terrorism and regional instability, is probably the top list. But we've seen in other contexts where the Trump administration has made very clear how important these resource considerations and questions are. It was a top of mind for them in Venezuela. So it's entirely possible that this is a part of the calculus in this discussion. I will say what they're getting in the immediate term is major negative impacts on global energy markets, because even if the Iranians haven't functionally shut the Straits of Hormuz, no ships are passing through. So that means you're cutting off both natural gas and oil exports, and that has real meaning geostrategic implications.
Indeed, and one other issue in the Strait of Hormuz, of course, is food supplies for the Gulf states. Lots of foods coming through by sea, and of course, no food shortages there yet, but it's a strong possibility on the horizon that that could happen. Going back to the situation regarding what happens next in Iran, though, how can Donald Trump carry this to his electorate and actually sort of look them in the eye and say, I mean what I say and I do what I mean, and I'm a man of my word, having campaigned on not getting the US involved in foreign forever wars?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I think it's so unlikely that ground forces will ultimately ever be committed to Iran, because there is a degree of ability to deny that the United States is involved in a longstanding war during an air campaign, right? There's an ability to say this is very different from Iraq. You've seen the Secretary of War point that out publicly, that troops are not going to be committed even as the president doesn't rule them out. I think he's politically quite astute and aware of the political implications of committing ground forces, and I think that will be something that he avoids doing at all costs.
I'd be interested to get your take in how you feel this has been handled as regards people who would once upon a time have been regarded as allies, and I think now perhaps President Trump, without being disrespectful, perhaps regards people like Starmer, Macron, etc., as inconveniences. How do you feel about the way it's all been handled in that sense? The attacks taking place, nobody being briefed, expecting people just to fall into line and follow. How do you feel about Trump's tactics there?
Yeah, look, I think that the Europeans have their own gripes with the Iranian government, and so no one is shedding a tear in that sense about the death of the Ayatollah. I mean, there are major geopolitical and geostrategic implications for what the United States and the Israelis have done, but I think the Europeans are in some form supportive of the goal of making a better change in government in Iran. Of course, the way in which the United States and the Israelis have gone about executing it brings a whole host of difficult questions with it. But I'm not so surprised that we haven't seen more sort of righteous indignance from European partners. Also because they are fighting difficult battles with the Trump administration on questions around the future of U.S. support to Ukraine, for instance, right? So they are picking and choosing where they push buttons with the Trump administration right now, I think.
You mentioned Ukraine. I have to ask you, Volodymyr Zelensky is saying that there's been a request from the United States for help in combating Shahid drones. It's interesting because a year ago, Donald Trump was telling Zelensky he didn't have the cards. Have the cards changed hands now in some way?
And well, look, let's take it in two parts. First, substantively, the Ukrainians absolutely have something to add here. They have been dealing with countering this technology on the battlefield since February of 2022 in a way that's very tangible and real. And so they have real battlefield expertise and value to bring. And I think it does represent a card for them to play in the context of the broader conversation on Ukraine, right? And so I think it remains to be seen how that process evolves alongside this. But I do think it is important and significant and politically meaningful that the president has asked for Ukrainian assistance in this regard.
Indeed. So that perhaps is one card to be played by Volodymyr Zelensky in a very judicious way. As we're speaking, information is coming into me via the link-ups here. 2 drone attacks targeting Iranian opposition camp in Iraqi Kurdistan. Is this what we're going to see more and more of? These kind of cross-border skirmishes happening like that, and essentially feeding that fire in the kind of regional groups?
Yes, I think absolutely. And this is part of the reason why experts like me are afraid of what's to come, because I fear now that the two sides are locked in a cycle of strike and counter that will be very hard to get out of. And I think the Iranians, because again of the way the campaign was framed by the president from the beginning as being about regime change, they are not incentivized to seek off ramps right now. They are incentivized to do what they can to make clear they're still a force to be reckoned with. And winning this war for them is survival. And so for them, making clear that they're still a threat despite what the Israelis and the United States have been able to accomplish militarily, tactically, which is quite significant. I don't want to understate the way in which the United States has executed a combined arms operation with the Israelis. It's quite impressive. But I do think we will see more of this kind of thing where the Iranians will seek to punish those they see as aligned with the United States in the region as a way of demonstrating their continued ability to affect regional affairs.
Indeed, it's one thing to be, how can I put it, impressed by how this has been carried out mechanically, but it's, as you're saying, Daniel, it's what happens next, where it leads us, and what happens to a region which is already volatile, already has many questions that are unanswered, already is seeing lots of unrest. What do you see happening next? What is your sense of where this goes between now, a year, 5 years?
Yeah, I think, look, this is an unprecedented moment in global geopolitics, at least as far as it goes between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And so we're sort of throwing the old playbook out the window. If you put a gun to my head and ask me to make a difficult choice, I would say this war ends with functionally a government in charge in Iran that even if it has a new supreme leader on its face, it's run by the IRGC. They are endemic in everyday life. And as I said, I think the political costs are too high for the United States to be willing to commit ground troops to try to change the government. So I think for the next 1 to 2 years, whenever this phase of this conflict ends, you will see a much more hardline government in place in Iran, and that's not good for regional interests.
Daniel Schneiderman, Director of Global Policy Programs at Penn Washington at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you, sir, very much for sharing your analysis with us, and thank you for your time. Greatly appreciated, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed.